You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our podcast today, as I told our guests before we hit record, as much as any book I've read in the last, let's say 5 years, because I've been doing the podcast roughly 5 years, 6, this book made me close it, put my head down, and look out into the sky like a dog looks at a television and go, why did I know that? How is that? The book is Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. It's written by Michael Vorenberg. He is a professor of history at Brown University. He's the author of several books on the Civil War. He has been a finalist for the Lincoln Prize. We've had some Lincoln Prize recipients on the podcast. So, Professor, when you win it, please come back. He was a key source for Steven Spielberg's 2012 film Lincoln. I may ask you just a few questions about that. I promise I won't dwell. Thank you, Professor Vorenberg, for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me on today. And it's great to be on the show and to be in such esteemed company as some of the folks you've mentioned and yourself, and for someone who's read the book. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And the idea of questioning when the Civil War ended, the American Civil War ended. We basically know when the British Civil War ended, and the Spanish Civil War, and the list goes on. The idea of questioning never occurred to me, ever. Like, it just ended. It ended when Lee surrendered on April 9th, and then Johnston, surrendered, about a month later? And in between, Lincoln was assassinated, and then all these crazy things happened. You take that sort of what I thought was settled history, and you turn it on its head in a way that is fabulously written and certainly thought-provoking. So, you've written these books on the Civil War, on Lincoln's time. Why this book? Why this topic?
I'm really no different from you. I didn't really think about the end of the Civil War as a particularly interesting topic. I thought it was kind of a settled matter. And that takes me to about 20 years ago. And a couple things were happening at the same time 20 years ago. One is that the U.S. was involved in invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And one of the things that happened, this was in 2003, is George W. Bush gave his so-called Mission Accomplished speech, standing in front of the Mission Accomplished banner, where he said that combat operations were over. And basically, the war was over. The war was over in Iraq. And, a lot of us knew at that time that the war wasn't over and this was theater. And of course, the war did go on for another 8 years. So that was happening. Meanwhile, I was working on a different book, and I just, through accident, really happened upon this file in this obscure box that said end of Civil War. And it was a thick file. And I thought, sort of like you were saying in the introduction, what's the big deal? Why do we need a big thick file on this? And I pulled it out and I looked into it, and there was just a lot of stuff there I hadn't really either thought about much or hadn't known. What the file was an assistant secretary of war, roughly around 1890, who was trying to figure out if there was an actual legal end date of the Civil War and what it was. And interestingly enough, he himself had been at Appomattox. He had been a U.S. officer at Appomattox. And now he was a civilian secretary of war, a lawyer, and had been given the task of saying, look, when was the end of war? Because, among other things, we've got people applying for pensions, and they're claiming that they're deserving of a wartime pension. And their service began in early 1866. But we all know that the war ended at Appomattox or maybe soon after. So what's the deal? And he started looking into it and started finding these things, and it was all in this file. And that's when I realized that someday, I'd like to do a book about like how the war ended and how it really ended. And the reason why I mentioned the U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan is because the answer to the legal question, just the legal question, is it was a proclamation by the president, Andrew Johnson, on August 20th, 1866. And it kind of struck me at that moment that the idea that a president could basically declare a war is over and that makes the war over seemed kind of strange or silly or, I don't know, odd, because you can't really declare a war to be over. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Johnson's declaration became the end of the Civil War legally. And then I found out later when I started really working on the book, which really didn't start till about 2013, that Bush's declaration, if I go back to that mission accomplished speech, there's a big database, which is the database that international relations experts use on statistics about war and the start and end date of every war since about 1812. And they use that speech by Bush in May of 2003 as the end date of U.S.-Iraq war. This despite the fact that the war was still going on in 2011 and Obama had to give his own end of war
Right.
So
Yeah.
to me, this whole idea like, okay, how do you end a war? Can you just declare it over? And of course, I know that's not true. And then for various reasons, I decided to really do this book in earnest. And once I did it, every twist and turn just unveiled new things for me that I hadn't known before, or I wanted to know more about. And I just did these deep dives into things, and just the learning experience was great. And it's sort of the book, it was hard to write in certain ways, but it was just really enjoyable to research these things and to get to ask these questions and to follow them through to the end.
Is there a difference between the war being over and the war ending? And by that, I mean the war, in my view, the war was over when Lincoln got reelected, but that's another podcast. Well, let's say the war was.
I see. I see what you mean by that. Okay, I thought you were headed a different direction. So you could ask the question, which I think is what you're saying about, at what point does Union victory become inevitable? And that's for you what you mean by when is the war over? You know, a traditional answer to that might be, oh, the Union victory at Gettysburg in 1863, which, by the way, I don't think is the answer to that question. But
No, I think it's a political answer, not a military answer. And when
and
Lincoln got
your answer,
reelected,
yeah,
that
Lincoln's reelection is a good one. And that's a good one. It's necessarily a hypothetical, right? Because we then have to say, well, could they have still pulled it out, the Confederacy? It's an important question in my book, actually, because I would probably take issue with you on that, on the whole idea of that inevitability of Union victory at that point. And I'll come back to that. So I don't think the war was over. It's a good choice, Lincoln's reelection. It made Union victory more certain. The war was ended for me. I really think the real difference is when does the fighting really over and when is the state of war over? And those are those are two different moments. And really the fighting war is over. Real organized armies are done fighting by, let's say, early June 1865.
right.
But a state of war continues indefinitely, although I would still, certainly, I wouldn't put it any further past 1871. And I really don't think you need to go much past 1867, which is when I end my book. There's a state of war, but it's a different kind of beast after 1867. But the major fighting's over by the summer of 65. On the issue of, this, I do want to spend just a second with you just to challenge, maybe push back and have you think about it this way.
I try not to argue with my guests because they're
No,
all
no,
they're
that's
all
all right.
experts.
Because on one hand, we know what we know, and that is that the Confederacy, from the beginning of the war, is trying to seek an alliance with anybody. England would be ideal. France would be great. Spain, okay. And we know that they never did. And we know that one of the reasons they had such trouble is because the Lincoln administration did such a good job of framing the Confederacy as a rebellion and saying that the Confederacy was not a legitimate nation, and therefore, under international law, you couldn't have a nation ally with it. Okay. However, what if, and this is the counterfactual business, right? What if France ends up siding with the Confederacy? Which the Confederacy never gave up on that idea, right up through 1865.
That's the whole. Let's free the slaves, make them soldiers. That changes the dynamic because now Lincoln can't use that against us. Just
Yeah, but
like, go ahead.
that turns out not to be so true either.
Exactly.
Especially for Napoleon. Napoleon didn't care about that stuff. And so Napoleon,
He did not.
This is Napoleon III, or Louis Napoleon, who's got troops in Mexico. He's installed Emperor Maximilian in Mexico. He controls Mexico. And so the Confederacy is thinking of this alliance. But I want us to think here about the comparison to the American Revolution. And this stuff, of course, is coming up a lot these days because as we're on the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, and I would argue that but for French intervention on the side of the revolutionaries, I'm not sure that the revolution goes the way it does. Right now,
I completely agree with you. B, I just posted a podcast by Eric Weddle, who wrote a book on Saratoga, and it's so clear after reading his book to me, and you can tell me I'm wrong on this one too, as well. Saratoga is the most important military engagement in the history of the United States. That's what I believe, even more so after reading this book. You tell me I'm wrong, and please go ahead.
No, I mean, I am not the expert on the American Revolution. I think it's Saratoga, of course, that is what sort of gets the French to say, yeah, I think this is a good risk, right?
Right.
If Saratoga goes the other way, French don't get in the war, and then that's it.
It's over.
Oh, I think you're right. And your author was right, too. Now, we know that the French never joined the Confederacy. The Confederate authorities, through even past Appomattox, I mean, they're still thinking that an alliance with France is possible. And if Napoleon decides to have any kind of alliance with the Confederacy, I think that, I still think Union victory is probably inevitable, but it's just everything is going to look different. Everything's just going to look so different at that point if there's any kind of alliance. So it's a live issue. And that's just an example of something in my book, that I write about, which is that there are people on the ground at the time, on all sides, worried about this, talking about it. So it's not until May, it's like a month after Appomattox, Grant orders Sheridan to the Mexican-Texas border. He goes to New Orleans, but he's ordering 50,000 U.S. troops to the border, the Mexican border. 50,000 U.S. troops. The war, right? We think of the war as being over. What's going on? 50,000 troops going to the border. And that has to do with the French in Mexico. It has to do with Texas being a distinctive problem. It also has to do with the possibility of the U.S. trying to take the opportunity maybe to invade if the French in Mexico give it a reason to. But there's this idea that the war could look different if France decides to get involved in a certain way.
I would say your description of that aspect, both politically, militarily, and geographically, is one that is so good. I hadn't really, nothing really happens. I mean, to your point, things could have happened, but nothing really happens. I had never really been able to read or been enticed to read it in the detail in which you describe it. It's terrific. I would also say neither the French nor the Mexicans or the Franco-Mexicans wanted any part of a battle-hardened Union army in 1865. And my Civil War professor in undergraduate school, he covered this a little bit because his PhD was in French diplomatic history. So he talked about it a little bit. But the way that you describe it, it is this last gasp a little bit of the Confederacy. Texas is so huge. Slavery is still rocking and rolling. Let's figure out a way to align with France. I love Civil War diplomatic history. I think Charles Francis Adams is the most underrated, important person of the American Civil War. We're not listening to me. We're talking to Professor Michael Vorenberg, who wrote the book, Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. You also made me loathe someone whom I didn't think I could loathe anymore. And I think he's the single worst president in the history of the United States. And that is Andrew Johnson. Talked a little bit, and we're jumping around, but I want to make sure that I bring this up. Andrew Johnson's performance in office in the period you said you in your book, as I recall, 1867. It starts before Appomattox. I love it. There was a great book about the Hampton Roads Conference, and I forget the name of the author, but I've read it a couple of times. Andrew Johnson becomes president April 15th, 1865. He now gets to run certain aspects of the military, although he defers to Stanton, as you point out. This whole notion of Reconstruction, how we're going to treat the states and treat Confederates, ordinary and Confederate leaders and military leaders. It's the worst possible time to have the worst possible president. Is that overstating it?
No, I don't use those phrases. I kind of wish I did. I think that's exactly right. I mean, really, if you think about it, I mean, the war itself is a time you really needed a great president, and the U.S. had one in Lincoln. Arguably, Reconstruction to be like the next most important time. If Lincoln dies, you really want someone who's a great president, and you have, unfortunately, one of the worst, if not the worst. And Johnson is on the ticket anew in 64. He wasn't the first vice president. They switch vice presidents, and that's a political decision to try to broaden the constituency of the Republican Party. And so Johnson's from Tennessee, and he's a Democrat. And so the idea here is the Republican Party trying to broaden itself geographically and to reach out to former Democrats. It all makes sense in a world in which presidents don't get assassinated, which is the world in which these people operated. And then, of course, Lincoln gets assassinated, which, again, we have to remember how shocking that was, unprecedented. And so, all right. So here's the weird thing. I agree with you that Andrew Johnson is definitely someone to loathe, and over the course of my book, it's probably hard to get out of my book without loathing him. When he becomes president, the expectation is that actually he's the right man for the job, absolutely the right man for the job. And by that, I mean the Republicans in Congress, the people who would become known as radicals, the leaders on emancipation, they really think Johnson is their guy, and in some ways better than Lincoln, because he is tough he sounds tough. His earliest known speeches are all about treason must be made odious and traitors must be punished. This idea that basically we are going to punish the Confederacy, and that means also confiscating their land, doing whatever it takes to make sure that we can never have this rebellion again. Furthermore, and this is what's really surprising if you don't know it already, is he's an emancipation person. So that's surprising because we think of Johnson as being such a reactionary on race, which he is. So certainly by late 65 and early 66, he's made it clear that he is an absolute white supremacist. He has no interest in pushing for Black civil rights, Black suffrage. However, up until that point, he was pro-emancipation. He had pushed for emancipation in Tennessee as the provisional governor there. He had made it clear that any state wanting to be back in the Union or to be part of the Union has to ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. So he's definitely pro-emancipation. But that turns out to be less about believing in something like equal rights for Black people and much more about sticking it to wealthy white Southerners.
That's exactly where I was headed, because your book delineates or describes something that fostered my own delineation in a way I hadn't really thought of it, and that is slavery and slave power. What is the difference between the two? And that dichotomy, seems to me, is how you explain Andrew Jackson's conduct, or Andrew Johnson's conduct in some ways.
Yeah. So slavery is an institution, economic mainly, and social and cultural, which involves the enslavement of African American people by white people. There's a lot more to say about it. It's hard to summarize this as, but
Sure.
it is the actual institution. Now, the slave power, sometimes called the slave system at the time, that's the idea that there exists an elite white group of slave owners who have a highly disproportionate amount of economic and political power. And they have allies in the North among the Democratic Party. Allies in the North who were helping them prior to the war, who were on the side of expanding slavery against Lincoln, who said no expansion, right? So the slave power is the idea of an elite group with disproportionate economic and political power. To destroy slavery and to destroy the slave power are not exactly the same thing. To destroy the slave power, right, that in some ways is easier. That's just a matter of taking away their economic and political power. And now you can do that in any number of ways. Political power, you can disfranchise them. So let's disfranchise all the leaders of the rebellion. Keep them from voting. You can confiscate their land. Again, these are all proposals that the radical Republicans had. Make them swear oaths of loyalty that are really tough for them to do without lying under oath. So these are all things you can do to kill the slave power. But killing slavery, that's a little bit different, because slavery as an institution is about mastery, and slavery can outlast the law. To kill slavery, you need absolute force in place. You basically need an army. You need an army that's committed to emancipation, that's willing to police the South, find places where slavery is still practiced, and make it go away. And make it go away by punishing the masters, making sure the enslaved people have legal rights, ideally access to land, access to jobs, and exactly the same rights as white people have. That's how you make slavery go away. That's a harder task, I think. Both tasks are hard, but the second one's, I think, harder.
And was Andrew Johnson fervently committed to either one?
I would say when he comes into office, he's fervently committed to destroying the slave power. He didn't really think much about slavery. It wasn't his thing. That is, he wasn't an abolitionist. He was the opposite of an abolitionist. He wanted the elite Southerners to be declawed in terms of economic and political power. And this has to do with his background. He grows up in true poverty in the South, and he's on the outside. So he ends up having a talent in politics, and he's recognized early, and he gets patrons who carry him along. And so he ends up being a pretty important politician in Tennessee. And he owned slaves. Not many, but some. And so he clearly had no trouble with the institution of slavery. What bothered him was the concentration of power in the upper crust of the South. So again, when he comes into power in April of 1865, that part of him is very much alive, that he hates the insiders, the inside Southern elite. And that's why he's making all this noise, like he's going to be tough against that group. And that harmonizes him with certain aspects of the radical Republicans, those aspects that have a certain vengefulness to the Southern slaveholders and the slave power. But those radicals also believe in black civil rights, black suffrage. Johnson doesn't.
And
And
how
so
much does go ahead, finish your
and,
thought.
and so that divide is not going to become clear until towards the end of 1865. The other part that no one anticipated, probably Johnson himself did not anticipate this, is that when the elite Southern whites start reaching out to Johnson and making a lot and saying, hey, we seek your pardon. And this is what Johnson does. He says, I demand of these people that they apply directly to me for a pardon. His Reconstruction policy is different from Lincoln's in one major way, which is that if you have $10,000 or more of property, you have to actually ask for a pardon. And this is his way of, like, again, going after the wealthy. What happens is that I think he realizes he kind of likes being in finally with the elite. And this is not the first time in history, right? This has happened where someone comes in as an outsider, bashing as a populist, right?
Right.
As a populist. And as a populist bashes the rich. And then turns out that when the rich come to them and say, hey, let's be friends, they pivot.
And that was exactly what I was going to ask you about. He seemed to get off on the fact that these wealthy plantation owners and Southern aristocrats, for lack of a better term, have to come to him for absolution / pardon. And, 30, 20, 40, 50 years before, he'd be cleaning their boots or they wouldn't be talking to him or anything. So he's getting that in a way that in some way, I imagine a sociologist or a psychologist could predict. But at the time, my man, Thaddeus Stevens, my fave, and we did have Bruce, and I don't know if you know Bruce Levine, but he came on the podcast to discuss his biography.
Great biography of Stevens. Yeah.
Oh, it's terrific. Anyway, they're taken aback by this and they can't believe that it's happening. And Johnson has no vice president because that's just not the way it worked back then. So who becomes the focus of opposition to Johnson? In other words, who do the radicals and the people who are unhappy with his performance and his policies, who do they focus on to be their man or their men?
Stanton is the short answer. Edward Stanton is the Secretary of War under both Lincoln and Johnson. And he's a funny character, too, in a very different way. And he's someone I understand even less than Andrew Johnson.
Oh, he's a prick. I don't care what side he's on. He's just a jerk.
Well,
how he treated Sherman was off. Anyway, that's my
there's this classic
podcast host.
There's this classic response, right? When someone calls somebody a jerk and somebody says like, well, yeah, but he's our jerk, right? And I think that was kind of Stanton for the Republicans. Like, yeah, he's a jerk, but he's our jerk. One of the puzzles is that he ends up being the focus of the radicals. He's the radicals' man in the White House, right? Why doesn't Johnson fire him until really late in the game? That's a question that I kept on returning to and having to kind of struggle for answers at different times. And I'm still not entirely satisfied with the answer I have. I've got a good answer for 65, early 66, but getting into early 67, it's really tough to explain that. And then he finally does get fired. But yeah, Stanton is a puzzle, and you can read biographies that the full spectrum, right? So William Marvell has a really good biography about Stanton, but calls him an autocrat and says he's Lincoln's autocrat. I don't know if you've seen any of the Apple TV series on Manhunt, but in that series, which I've only seen a few episodes, Stanton is a hero. He's a beautiful abolitionist, moral man, and and very good with people, at sort of mediating between people, which he certainly wasn't.
Well, you're kidding me.
No,
I've read the book. I haven't seen the
I don't know why the series played that up, but they do. So Stanton, yes, he is, let us say, prickly, but his goals are correct, which is that he understands and I think this is correct, he understands that you really have to have a state of war against the Southern white population, certainly the elite, in order to achieve the goals of the war. So if the goals of the war are reunion and emancipation, how do you achieve that? And Stanton understands how to do that, and that it's going to require military force. And his intellectual counterpart in my book, who really gives voice to this, is Richard Henry Dana Jr. Dana Jr. gives a speech that's famous in the summer of 1865 called the Grasp of War speech, which is the idea that when you have your enemy beaten, you don't just let them up. And Lincoln was more let them up. Dana was you keep them in the grasp of war until you have secured from them whatever is needed to make security assured such that this war could never happen again. Now, for Richard Henry Dana, that meant a number of things. One of them was black suffrage, black universal suffrage for men. He was no female suffragist.
Right.
That's just an example. Stanton is in the administration, so he's not giving speeches. But he is acting and he controls the army, and he's doing in action what Dana is doing in voice. And that's how I see it, anyway.
And what's Dana's position? What's his prominence?
He has no government position in the summer of 65. He, at that point, has been, however, I should say, even though he has no position in the government, he is one of the most respected international lawyers. He's one of the go-to international lawyers. And for that reason, for example, when the U.S. government needs a top lawyer to take a really important case before the Supreme Court in 1863 that involves international law, they go to Dana. And so Dana has held minor offices in Massachusetts, where he's from, and he wanted a higher office, but he was a superb attorney and a superb, and he wrote legal treatises. Although it's funny, he's actually best known for something he had done many, many years before, which was to write a memoir of his time in the Navy, or on a naval ship, I should say. This is 2 years before the mast. He's just a great character, Dan. He drops out of college, he drops out of Harvard, after a year of study or so, and then, says, I'm going to get on board this merchant ship and see the Pacific, see the world. And then he writes a memoir that's a bestseller. But that sort of introduces him to all sorts of things that will evolve for him into international law. So he's a really interesting character, very important to me because of these two speeches he gives. The lesser known one is a speech he gives the day after the Appomattox surrender, where he says, peace was not made, the war continues. That's obviously a kind of theme in my book. And then the second one is the one I just mentioned, much more famous, where he talks about the grasp of war.
Who's more dyspeptic, Jefferson Davis or Edwin Stanton?
Well, actually, so probably Davis. Yeah, that's an interesting call. No, Davis is very dyspeptic. Davis is dyspeptic both physically and emotionally.
That's exactly right.
and he's got physical problems. He's got problems with his eye. He's got problems with his health. But he's also just very difficult to deal with. I mean, that's also an interesting thing about Jefferson Davis is that, I was describing Johnson, that when Andrew Johnson comes in to the White House in the Union, he has allies. He has people who think that he's great. Jefferson Davis never has, I would argue, that kind of support from the Confederacy. So, as I'm guessing, already know, people within his own inner circle don't think much of him, including his own vice president, Alexander Stephens.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies. We are a public relations enterprise here in Indianapolis, Indiana. We are a federally certified, veteran owned small business. Our guest, Michael Vorenberg, he's a professor, Brown University.
Yes.
Lincoln's Peace is the book he wrote, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. I read it. It's superb. We are discussing it, but since we don't post the video for these podcasts, only the audio, you can't see what's behind the professor's profile here. So I'm going to ask him, is there a particular Hoosier leader and or legend you admire most? And is it Lew Wallace, since there's a book about Lew Wallace behind on your bookshelf?
If I adjusted my camera, you would see many books on Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace he's certainly the Indiana man I am most interested in and probably will ever be the most interested in. Absolutely. I have been to the Lew Wallace study. Maybe I'll take this chance to shout out to the staff there and recommend to any folks in Indiana who haven't been to the Lew Wallace study in Crawfordsville that they make the trip. I could speak forever about Lew Wallace. So that's an example, right? This conversation started with, you were sort of talking about why don't I know these things? And for me, there were just a lot of moments of that. Like, why don't I know these things? So for Lew Wallace, I've always known that he was a Civil War general. And the reason Wallace is best known, it's really unfortunate, is that he gets a bad rap at Shiloh as a general. Now, that's his Civil War career, but he's obviously best known for being the author of Ben-Hur, which is the best-selling novel in American history written by an American. That used to be the case. I think it's probably still the case. And I always thought that was kind of interesting. What I didn't know until I really went deep on this is that he served on both military commissions, the one that tried the Lincoln assassins, and then the one that's really important in my book, and he's the head of the commission that tries Henry Wirz, who is the commandant of Andersonville POW camp. And that service on Wirtz's commission is really important, I think. And it got me very interested in Wirtz. Excuse me. Yes, very interested in Wirtz, but also very interested in Wallace. Wallace, it turns out, is not only a novelist, not only a military commander and politician, but he's also an artist. He does sketches of the conspirators that kill Lincoln. He does sketches of Henry Wirz. He does paintings that are in the Lew Wallace study. He ends up, because of Ben-Hur, he ends up the consul to Constantinople, to Istanbul, and a Middle East kind of expert. So his later novels all have to do with the Near East. So he's just a fascinating man.
And he'd be your choice as the Hoosier leader or legend you admire most?
Absolutely.
There are so many dates in your book, which are necessary because the legal date, the president date, Appomattox date, is it difficult for you as a historian, or is it helpful for you as a historian to have the sort of chronology that, okay, this is what's happening when, putting everything into context, because there is no declaration of war. I mean, the North doesn't declare war against the South. I mean, there's the call for volunteers, the attack on Fort Sumter, the list goes on and on. So there's no Treaty of Paris. There's no treaty of the end of the Pacific War or VE Day, those sorts of things. As a historian, was it difficult to sort out all this sort of miasma?
It was. And also, I'm a historian who writes history, but I also teach history at Brown. I've taught history for a long time. I taught it at the high school level before I went to grad school. And, I think one of the cruelest things we as historians do is to make people memorize dates. So the idea that I would end up writing a book where dates actually matter is kind of ironic, because I spend a lot of time in my courses saying, look, just there are certain things you should know the sequence of events generally, but let's not get too hung up on dates. But here, dates matter a great deal. And it turns out that the sequence of things matters a great deal. The fact that something happens in one place and then a few days later something else happens, those things are often connected. So, yeah, the timeline here matters a great deal. And so much is happening every single day, right? So, April 9 is the surrender of Lee to Grant. And only a few days later, Lincoln gets assassinated. That is 5 days later. That means 5 days later, the whole world changes in every possible way. On April 9th, the idea of a harmonious surrender is at least conceivable to some degree. On April 15th, the day after Lincoln's assassination, the possibility of a harmonious surrender now becomes almost out of reach. Why? Because most Northerners assume that the Confederacy is behind the surrender, that Jefferson Davis ordered it or knew about it, that this is somehow a war action. Now, we today know that that's not true, but they, at the time, it would be natural that they assumed that this was a war action. And the result is, of course, rage and this idea of, oh no, this whole idea of a peaceful Appomattox surrender is not necessarily the way we're going to go. I write about the fact that when Sherman goes off to make his negotiations with Johnston down in North Carolina, this is just a week after Appomattox, he is just about to get on the train to go meet with Johnston and his officers, and he learns that Lincoln's been assassinated. And he says to his officers, do not tell the men, because he's worried that if the men find out, his men, that they'll go into the countryside and just start killing people in reprisals. And he's right. I mean, I'm not sure that could have stopped.
Right.
And it also then changes everything. So when Sherman goes to make peace with Johnston and tries to make a peace that's actually a peace, not just a surrender, not just a ceasefire or a
military convention, yeah.
Really tries to create a military convention that goes well beyond Appomattox. It's shot down. And that's where Stanton, as you mentioned earlier, Stanton comes out obviously against it. It might have had a better shot of success if the rage wasn't there about the Lincoln assassination.
My favorite quote of the war, and that's not true, my favorite quote about the war, next to the defeat of the Confederacy, the death of Abraham Lincoln is the darkest day the South ever knew. And that quote is from Jefferson Davis. In your view, how accurate is that quote?
I think it's accurate. I don't know if he actually said it, but I think he definitely, if he didn't say it, he said something like it when he found out, because he knew, right, that the chance of negotiating something like a peace that would serve the interests of the Confederacy were now pretty much gone with Lincoln's death, that, they could fight it out. I think what's really important to understand, and you mentioned diplomatic history. So diplomatic history is actually really relevant here. It's not win or lose, right? It's not win or lose. Think of this as if you are the president of the Confederacy or you're in the Confederacy leadership, what is the best deal you can get and how can you get it? So
Right.
Jefferson Davis, from the beginning, what they want is a separate nation and to be treated as a complete sovereign separate nation. Now, it may be that after Appomattox, after the surrender of Johnston at Bennett Place a week later, actually a few weeks later, it may be that Davis understood that goal of all those ceded states being a nation, that goal was probably gone. But that doesn't mean that the whole game was lost. Could some lesser deal have been struck? With Lincoln's assassination, it just becomes highly unlikely that any deal can be struck. So it's a very dark day. And that is Davis's reaction. He's like, this is going to be trouble. This is going to be trouble. because they're not going to be interested in negotiating with us at this point.
Almost somewhat ironic that Lincoln would have been he was more strident about slavery than Johnson, but Johnson appeared to have been more strident about slave power, maybe than Lincoln would have been with the 10%, because the people who wanted to break the slave power aren't necessarily the same people who thought slavery was some sort of abomination.
Yeah.
And you've got Edwin Stanton, who I believe was Attorney General under one of the greatest abettors of slave power in American history, James Buchanan from Pennsylvania. So do you think that kind of colored a little bit of Stanton's views and actions? He saw what a true appeaser was like.
Yes. But again, when Andrew Johnson comes into power, so a couple things. Johnson is, first of all, deferential to Stanton. But the other thing is that Johnson is sick. He's physically ill for much of the summer of 65. So Stanton basically kind of takes charge. I always think about, this, you remember during the Reagan attempted assassination, Alexander Haig saying, I'm in charge here, that famous. So it's hard not, it's sort of, that's how I think of Stanton at this moment. And Stanton is in charge. The difference is Stanton really was in charge. Stanton absolutely believed that Jefferson Davis was involved in or directly commanded the assassination of Lincoln. And his ally in this, by the way, Joseph Holt, who's the Judge Advocate General, is crucial. These two men, they play a big part in my book. They want to see Davis captured, tried, and executed. Absolutely. And when Andrew Johnson comes in and says treason must be made odious and traitors must be punished, that's what he sounds like too. So this is about strident punishment, which is going to mean the execution of the lead rebel, who is Jefferson Davis. That was the goal. And it turned out that they didn't get it for all sorts of reasons, but that's what they want. They absolutely want, and they don't want any kind of bargaining. And that, one of the remarkable things is how quickly that falls away.
Yeah.
Not with Stanton and Holt, but with others. That Republicans are very quick, not just Johnson, but other people like Horace Greeley, who's an abolitionist, is willing to give Davis a pass and to move on, right? So actually Greeley helps pay the bail to get Davis released ultimately.
In your opinion, should Davis have been executed?
No.
Should Wirz have been executed?
Excuse me?
Henry
Wirz?
Wirz?
Yeah, no. I find that post-war executions, and I write about, and this is why I wrote about the executions, because I was generally interested in what kind of markers end wars, right? So generally speaking, we might think of like a last battle or a last surrender or a treaty. You mentioned a treaty. One we often forget, but it's almost always there, are executions. And so if we look to the end of World War II, there were executions. Right. What we learn by looking at those executions, the Tokyo war crime tribunals, the Nuremberg trials, I regard them, having studied them somewhat, as basically, at the time, unsatisfactory. That is, they pleased no one. They didn't go far enough for those who really wanted executions, and they were embarrassing to those who thought there should be no executions. So I don't think post-war executions necessarily work very well. I think it becomes an embarrassment. And I think there are other ways you can punish really effectively. The danger of executions, there are many, is you can make a martyr of somebody. Wirz wasn't a very good martyr, although there is a monument to him down in Andersonville that the local townspeople have set up, and he did become a martyr to some. Jefferson Davis would have become a martyr. If he had been executed, he would have been beloved in a way that he never was beloved in actual life.
That's exactly right. Are you against the death penalty generally? So therefore,
Yeah,
It's in
that
line
does,
with your.
and I'm glad you brought that up because I should concede that does color my vision, and that's a political view. There are those who believe in the death penalty, and there are those who don't. We both, each side has their arguments. I'm willing to It's interesting. I do. So yeah. In answer to your question, I concede that I am generally against the death penalty. But let me just say this about that, which is that on a number of occasions, in talking to other Civil War historians who also are generally against the death penalty, when I bring up the instance of Henry Wirz, the commandant of Andersonville, they, to a person, say, "Oh yeah, but he should have been killed. He's the exception." When you look at who was actually executed after World War II, the most common people, the most frequent people to get killed are the heads of POW camps.
That's right.
And for them, there is no mercy. They are always seen as the most heinous people. And maybe they are. I mean, they are in the worst position, and I'm not trying to excuse them at all. But it fascinates me that once I really started looking into it, it made all the sense in the world that Henry Wirz was executed, but Jefferson Davis was not.
You probably remember Andrew Jacobs, the congressman. He was on the Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, represented Indianapolis, Indiana for several decades.
Yes.
I got to be friends with him,
Yes.
and I'm one of the few Republicans who are against the death penalty, even though I believe people deserve it. Ted Bundy, you deserve it. But it's the finality of it and the notion that you could execute an innocent man, which has been done who knows countless times in American history, makes me blanch a little bit. Andrew Jacobs and I never got in a political argument ever, but we got in one hell of an argument at lunch at one time about Mary Surratt.
Ah, excellent
Con-
example.
Congressman Jacobs believed that Mary Surratt was completely innocent and did not deserve to be executed. Professor Vorenberg, where do you stand on that issue? I, of course, called him a Nancy boy and a sissy, which just made it all humorous. But he gave a powerful argument that she was completely innocent, and that's a miscarriage of justice. What would you say?
I wouldn't go that far. No, she was guilty. I wouldn't have executed her, but she was guilty, absolutely guilty. She abetted an assassination of an American president. But no, I don't think she deserved to be hanged. And I think that I think it speaks to the moment, and it speaks to Stanton, and it speaks to Holt. If somehow they had the kind of lawyers that could have delayed the trial for like a few months, I don't think she would have been hanged. I think the moment was the moment, and they were going to hang those people, as many as they could. They only got 4. The 4 others were sent to prison. But and the way you know this, right, is that she was as guilty as her son John.
Right.
They were equal in guilt or in innocence. John Surratt got away to England. He comes back something like a year later to the U.S. and they get him. They've got him, but they decide not to hang him. In fact, he basically goes free. And that shows you how time can change things. And that, to me, is another part of the problem with the death penalty, is that if done too quickly, you lose the chance of reflection. Although today, of course, many of the people who are executed and for criminal convictions are sitting on death row for a long time. But at that time, those executions were hastily done, and they were done before military tribunals. They were done on really bad evidence. So I think she was guilty, but I'm not sure. I don't think she was supposed to be hanged.
And the trial process was an abomination, no matter
It
how you
was
felt
indeed.
about the assassinations, excuse me. We have a few more minutes with Professor Michael Vorenberg, author of Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. I want to ask you quickly about one person, then I want to take 5 or 10 minutes if we can to talk about the freed slaves, because I just got done doing a podcast about the slaves that Sherman's March was the greatest emancipation action event in the Civil War in American history. No discussion of this time in American history after the Civil War at the end of it and then post is complete without mentioning Ulysses S. Grant. He was the one man, it seemed, who Johnson was most afraid of. Perhaps there were others on the list. How does Grant, who becomes president in 18, is elected president in 1868, what are his activities during this time period? How does his attitude change from, let's say, summer of 65 through the end of your book?
So he's a great example, maybe the best example, of someone whose mind and views do change. And I think that's really important. It seems obvious that anyone's minds can change, but I think we live in an era when people who change their minds or whose views evolve, they're seen as somehow politically weak. They're compromisers, and that's a bad thing, right?
Dino, Rhino. Yes, I'm familiar.
Exactly, right. And it that stains you for life. But Grant changes in really significant ways during this period. So he is the man of Appomattox, right? He's the man who legend tells us, and it's true basically, that gives generous terms to Lee and is willing to give generous terms to the elite of the Confederacy generally. And in the summer of 1865, he is talking about how in his farewell speech to the army, he's basically speaking all these kind things about the Confederacy and the fact that peace is here at hand, right? So that's a moment. If we just take that moment, midsummer 1865, there's Grant. Now let's jump, if we will, to 1868, and Grant is campaigning for president. And what's his slogan? It's "Let us have peace." So the point is that between those 2 points, Grant learns and sees the truth of the Confederate spirit
That's a great way to put it. Exactly right.
and sees the truth of what we might today call the diehard rebel, that these people were not ready to give up. And it didn't matter if you gave them generous terms or not. They were going to fight on. Not all of them, but enough that there were insurgencies throughout the South. There were racial massacres across the South. Grant knew these things. And Grant was keeping track of these things. President Johnson, basically is having Grant do his bidding, and Grant is a loyal man and does as much of the bidding as for Johnson as he can. And Grant is far more popular than Johnson. Grant is far more popular than anyone. Grant is the most popular man in America. And he could have used that popularity to become a president early on or challenge, but he doesn't. He's a very loyal person. But a point comes, and it comes in 67, when he really can't take it anymore with Johnson. He just can't. And that break happens. And why can't he take it anymore is because he realizes and that the South is not giving up. He realizes that there's a race war basically going on in the South. And he also realizes that Johnson is absolutely uncommitted to seeing the real war, through to its finish. And so there has to be a break.
And the real war leads me to, I want to mention the book that I alluded to. The author was Bennett Harton.
Yes.
Yeah, the book's
About Sherman's March. I know the book well. It's a great book.
It is a terrific book. He was a wonderful podcast guest. The author of the book is Somewhere Towards Freedom, Sherman's March, and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. The reason I bring that up is because it seems that there was this general, whether it was a positive or negative view, that, okay, the slaves are freed. It's 13th Amendment. The war's over. They're great. They're in great shape. We don't need to do anything else. And in my view, next to the Holocaust, which I've never really brought myself to read about too much, the Jim Crow era of American history is the biggest tragedy. You know, you don't have 6 million murdered. But it's the biggest lost opportunity in American history, in my view, that's combined with cruelty and disregard and apathy. And to your point, Grant sees it. He's one of the few. And what happened to the freed slaves in the late 1860s in this time period is just unconscionable. That's not really a question. It's more of an assertion, but you discuss it a little bit in your book, and then Professor Parton has it in his. How did the existence both of the slave power, the freed slaves, affect the struggle to end the American Civil War?
I want to take a moment to push back on what you just said there a bit. Not about the Holocaust, but I think the worst part of African American history is the period of racialized slavery. And thinking about Reconstruction in the era of Jim Crow as sort of the darkest period, that is a way that historians often think about it. But I think it's worth remembering that for some years now, really since the 1970s, historians have pushed back against that by saying, look, it's true that there was horrible violence done to Black people during Reconstruction, and disfranchisement eventually in terms of suffrage by the end of the century into the early 20th century. However, there was also great achievement during Reconstruction, not only for Black people, but for white people who served under the Reconstruction governments when they were Republican in the South. And the achievements of Reconstruction must be remembered as well. And so work by Eric Foner, more recently by Manisha Sinha, I think so I'll just mention this as sort of something to remember, that it wasn't all the dark era. However, what makes it so painful, and I think the pain you're describing here, is the lost opportunity, is that under slavery, of course, there's a sense that so little could be achieved. Under Reconstruction, there's a sense of everything could be achieved. And
That's the point I was making. I wasn't trying to compare it to slavery, which is sui generis. I was saying compared to what could have happened, it's almost like Germany post World War I, like what could have happened with the democracy or the republic or whatever they were trying to do is such a lost opportunity. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So that's right. And so one of the reasons that there is a lost opportunity here, well, there's a number of reasons I go into in my book. But first of all, let me just say that one of the themes of my book that I still think is, for me, at the heart and what I care most about is the following: that how do you measure when a war is over? A question I've already asked. Arguably, the best way to think about it is when the goal of the victors is attained. The goal of the victors was reunion and emancipation together. Lincoln had made it clear that emancipation was absolutely a goal. And that was both in the proclamation, his second inaugural, and his actual policies. Okay. So how is it then that you have a war that theoretically ends, and yet emancipation is not achieved? And by that I mean, you do get the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery. But if emancipation means an equality such that everyone has the same rights, right, under Lincoln's formulation of labor and to earn the products of one toil and so forth, and it means other things too. If that's emancipation, then that goal is not attained by the war. And we who would put a mark on the timeline that the war is over, that somehow doesn't acknowledge that that is not attained, that's a problem. That's a problem for me.
Right.
And so one of the reasons that happens has to do with what you're saying, which is a notion that emancipation can be what some people call self-executing, which is declare that slavery is over, and then slavery is over. And I would say that that is about as an absurd a proposition as saying declare that the war is over, and then the war is over. And in a sense, that's what happens. So the 13th Amendment, it abolishes slavery and it writes it into the Constitution. It means absolutely nothing unless you get enforcing legislation and, equally, if not more important, force on the ground to actually make it happen on the ground. Without those two things, emancipation as a constitutional provision is next to meaningless. It's a great moral declaration, but in terms of actually ending slavery, no. So Congress does a lot of this work, and the Army does a lot of this work. Say what you will about Stanton. He puts the Army to work doing this. Grant does it. Grant battles the Klan in South Carolina. That's a really important moment, just to give one of many. The Army is willing to say against Johnson, this is what ends up doing Johnson in. The Army says, here's a list of all the atrocities done to Black people and why the Army must stay in. That ends up winning the day. So Congress takes charge of the Army. These are all victories in terms of people saying whatever needs to be done to end slavery on the ground, that's what has to be done. And in 67, that's what looks like it's going to happen. And it still looks like it's going to happen, I would argue, right up until the war against South Carolina's Klan in 70 and beyond. It does begin to fade, and that is a different issue. But that's a war against slavery, even though it's been outlawed since 1865.
Reminds me, I need to have Fergus Bordewich back on to discuss his book on the very time period that you discussed.
And Fergus's book, Fergus has an excellent book about the Klan War, especially in South Carolina. That's right.
He was on to discuss, I think it was Congress at War, the book he wrote about the American Congress during the Civil War. We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor, are you ready?
I am.
What was your first job?
I was a landscaper. I cut lawns.
What was your first concert?
The Doobie Brothers.
Michael McDonald or Tom Johnson?
That's pretty impressive, by the way. It was McDonald.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Thucydides. No, I take that back. Herodotus, the histories.
The histories?
Yeah.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I wasn't ready for that. I'll pick the Hampton Roads Conference.
Yeah.
Early February 1865.
That's a good one.
We don't know anything really about it, so I'll pick that one.
You're not supposed to be ready for these questions. Last one. This one you're not ready for either, but I got a feeling you're going to knock it out of the park. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Lew Wallace.
Living today.
Oh, living today.
Living today, yes.
Oh. Yeah, he's not alive.
Well, he's still with us. He's just not alive, correct?
That's great. Sarah Polley.
And she is?
She's I think one of the most talented directors working today, also an actress, but more famous as a director in Hollywood. I think a generation of genius directors, young people that are out there. And she's an incredible reader, an amazing reader, and thoughtful. So I'm also thinking about people who would actually talk. So a hero of mine is Bruce Springsteen, but Springsteen's got nothing else to say that he hasn't already put in print or in song. So I'm trying to think of people who I would actually like to talk to.
Barack Obama is the most frequent selection. I'll just tell you that very quickly. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise and federally certified veteran-owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Professor Michael Vorenberg. We discussed his thought-provoking, I was going to say head-scratching. That's not true. It just made me scratch my head again. Why didn't I know this? His marvelous book, Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. Professor, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Robert. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.